Alright, so today we're going to be doing a recrystallization procedure. Recrystallization is used to purify or get rid of any impurities that you have in your compound. Here I have a 125 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask with 1 gram of benzoic acid, and I'm heating up ethanol here on the hot plate because benzoic acid dissolves easily in ethanol. You want to use an Erlenmeyer flask to heat up the ethanol instead of a beaker because the ethanol will evaporate too quickly out of the beaker, whereas not as quickly from the Erlenmeyer. So I'm going to add as little ethanol as possible to the benzoic acid to dissolve it. Now, one other note before I do that, you don't want to heat up the ethanol too quickly because then it will start boiling really fast and it'll flash. Flashing is whenever the solvent will just jump out of the Erlenmeyer flask. So I'm going to add as little as possible. And then start to swirl it, see if it'll dissolve. And you'll always want to make sure to keep your Erlenmeyer flask on the hot plate so that it'll dissolve more easily. Right now it looks like there's still some benzoic acid in there, so I'll add a little bit more ethanol. And it looks like it's dissolved. So you want to keep it on the hot plate just a little bit longer. You don't want it to really be boiling, although it'll help it dissolve if you're using another compound and that compound's not very soluble in the solvent. So once it's dissolved, we can let it cool to room temperature, but it's probably better if you look here that there's still a lot of solvent in here. I may have added a little bit too much, so if we let this boil off just a little bit, the recrystallization might work better. Okay, so I turned out the hot plate just a little bit, and as you can see the ethanol is starting to boil. You want it to boil off just a little bit. Remember not to let it boil off too quickly, otherwise it might flash. In this case we don't have too much solvent in there, so it's okay. But if you have more, you don't want to heat it up as fast. So I think this is probably enough now. So we're going to let this cool to room temperature. So let's move over to the lap bench. As you can see, the ethanol is still boiling even though we took it off the hot plate. So let it cool to room temperature. What we have here on the side is an ice bath in a crystallizing dish, and I'm putting a beaker, an Erlenmeyer flask, of ethanol here in the ice bath to keep it cold. What we're going to do for recrystallization is actually we're going to precipitate out the benzoic acid from here and then vacuum filter it through here. So let's talk a little bit about vacuum filtration. So this is called a Buchner funnel. Inside it we have a number 4 filter paper. The number 4 filter paper has very small pores, so your product does not fall through into the flask here. So here's the number 4 filter paper. It's actually too big for this Buchner funnel, so we cut it with scissors. Now, you don't want your filter paper to actually form any folds here on the side. You want it to fit nicely inside of it. So I've already cut it and put it here in a good size. As you can see, all the holes are covered and there's no folds around the edges of the Buchner funnel. Now the Buchner funnel is connected to this flask, which is connected to a solvent trap. And the solvent trap is connected to the aspirator here in the sink. We have the water running, and what this is doing is actually pulling air and creating a vacuum here. If you're wearing gloves, you can put your hand on the Buchner funnel and you can actually feel the air being pulled, and your gloves will go like this in the funnel so you can tell that the vacuum's working. You want to wet your filter paper with some either deionized water or whatever solvent it is that you're actually using. So in this case, I'm going to wet it with some cold ethanol, just a little bit. As you can see, it's being drained down into the flask. Now it's important to have the solvent trap here, because when you turn off the water, what happens is some of the water backs up. And if you don't have this here and it's directly connected to the water aspirator, your flask here, the water will back up into the bottom of the flask, which you don't want to happen. So it's really important to have your solvent trap clamped here in between. So let's look back here. This is cooling down. It's still a little bit hot. You don't want to put it directly inside the ice bath. You want to let it cool down to room temperature first before you do that. If you immediately take it from the heating mantle and you put it in the ice bath, the precipitate will actually be really fine, and we don't want that. We want it to be a little bit bigger crystals. So it's cooled down enough now. It's closer to room temperature, so we're going to put it in the ice bath. And after a few minutes, it should begin to recrystallize. You'll see little precipitate forming on the bottom. Alright, so we waited a few minutes so far and there are no crystals forming, so we're going to try what's called seeding. We're going to use a glass rod and we're going to just start scratching the bottom of the Erlenmeyer flask with the glass rod to try to make the benzoic acid precipitate out of the solution. So you just start scratching the bottom. Be careful not to break the rod or the flask because they're fragile. Once you scratch it enough, maybe for a minute or so, put it back on the ice bath and it should precipitate out. Alright, so after about 5 minutes of staying in the ice bath, the product started to recrystallize, as you can see the precipitate on the bottom. So what we're going to do now is actually filter it, because there is still some ethanol that's in there that we need to get rid of. So let's move over here to the filter. Now remember that we need to wet the filter paper. Since we did it a little while ago, it's dry again. So let's wet the filter paper. Make sure, by the way, that you have the water on so that the vacuum will actually be working. So pour some of the solvent. Make sure it's cold onto the filter paper. You don't want it to be hot or room temperature because then it might dissolve your product. So now that we've wet the filter paper, we can pour our recrystallized product onto the filter paper. So just pour it slowly. Let it collect on the filter paper. As you can see, it drained down. The solvent drained down into the flask. Now there's still some product here on the Erlenmeyer flask, so we want to get as much product as we can back, and there's also some here on the glass rod. So I'm just going to wash the glass rod with some ethanol. Now it's off the glass rod. And finally, from the Erlenmeyer flask, just add a little bit of your cold solvent, swirl it, and just try to get it so that it gets any remaining product off the walls onto your filter paper. So for the most part, it looks like the flask is clean. Now if you look on the filter paper, it's kind of hard to tell. We have some product here and all over the filter paper here. And we've got the solvent in here. Now you might also have some product that managed to get through the filter paper. In here, this is called the mother liquor. So what you can do then is take off your Buchner funnel and pour out your mother liquor into a separate Erlenmeyer flask, and then attempt to recrystallize it again and refilter it again to save some more of your product. Again, you need to make sure you have the solvent trap in between, otherwise when you turn that water off, it might back up right here into your mother liquor and then your product will be ruined. So after this is done, you can take out the filter paper just using a spatula and you can weigh it. Now it would be good to probably pre-weigh your filter paper in order to be able to tell how much your product actually weighs, and then you can calculate your yields after that. That's basically how you do a recrystallization using one solvent.